At 14,000 feet over the Rhine River on March 17, 1945, Captain James Connelly watched his bombardier shake his head for the third time. They'd made 3 separate bombing runs on the Remagen railway bridge, and all 36 500-pound bombs had missed. The bridge remained intact, trains still crossing, German reinforcements still moving west. Connelly's B-26 Marauder was burning fuel, his crew exhausted, and headquarters was demanding results. The standard bombing approach, flying straight down the long axis of the bridge, had failed completely. Again. Then Connelly did something that violated every bombing doctrine taught at training bases across America. He banked his aircraft 90 degrees, lining up perpendicular to the bridge rather than parallel to it. His bombardier, Lieutenant Robert Chen, protested over the intercom. This wasn't how you bombed bridges. The target profile was too narrow, the margin for error too small. But Connelly held the bank, steadied the aircraft, and gave Chen the go signal. 12 bombs released in a tight string. Connelly rolled wings level and began his turn away from the target. Behind them, 11 bombs detonated in the Rhine. The 12th struck the bridge's southern support pier dead center. The massive stone structure cracked, shifted, and 20 seconds later collapsed into the river, taking 2 spans of steel railway bridge with it. Connelly's crew sat in stunned silence. They'd just accomplished with 1 sideways pass what 3 conventional runs couldn't achieve. The hit rate hadn't just improved, it had become lethal. What Connelly discovered that morning wasn't in any bombardier manual. It contradicted explicit instructions from 8th and 9th Air Force bombing doctrine. It seemed mathematically impossible, presenting the narrower dimension of the target should reduce hit probability, not increase it. Yet within weeks, bomber groups across Europe were adopting sideways bombing runs for bridge attacks, and German engineers were watching their carefully maintained transportation networks disintegrate under a tactic that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of sideways bombing represents one of World War II's most counterintuitive tactical innovations. It emerged not from aeronautical engineers or bombing theorists, but from desperate crews who'd watched their bombs miss critical targets mission after mission. Between late 1944 and the war's end in May 1945, this unconventional approach transformed American bombing effectiveness against bridges, from roughly 15% hits to better than 45%, a tripling of accuracy that directly accelerated Germany's military collapse. This wasn't about technology or new bomb designs. This was about geometry, timing, and understanding that sometimes the textbook answer is wrong and survival demands thinking perpendicular to doctrine. The bridges of Europe became the testing ground for tactical innovation, born from mathematical reality, colliding with operational desperation. American strategic bombing doctrine in 1943 and early 1944 focused primarily on area targets, factories, marshalling yards, oil refineries. These were large targets where precision mattered less than volume. A bomb that missed the intended building but destroyed something nearby still contributed to the mission objective. Bridge bombing was different. A near miss on a bridge was a complete failure. The bomb either destroyed the structure or it didn't. There was no partial credit. The standard approach to bridge bombing, as taught at bombardier schools in New Mexico and Texas, involved flying along the bridge's length. The bombardier would sight down the long axis of the structure, calculate wind drift and ballistic trajectory, and release bombs in a string timed to bracket the target. In theory, At least one bomb in the string would strike the bridge deck or a support structure. In practice, the hit rate was dismal. A railway bridge presented a target roughly 20 feet wide and perhaps 300 feet long. Flying parallel to that length meant the bombardier had a 300-foot margin for error in the direction of flight, but only a 20-foot margin laterally. Wind drift, even slight errors in airspeed calculation, or minor turbulence could push bombs left or right of the narrow target. Multiple bombing runs on the same bridge often produced multiple strings of bombs in the river on either side, with the bridge untouched between them. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen became strategically critical in early March 1945, when American ground forces captured it intact, giving the Allies their first crossing point over the Rhine. German forces desperately tried to destroy it with everything available: artillery, combat engineers, even V-2 rockets. American commanders equally desperately needed to protect it and to destroy other nearby bridges to prevent German counterattacks. 9th Air Force bomber groups received urgent orders to destroy German-held bridges near Remagen while protecting the American-held span. The missions were flown at medium altitude, 10 to 15,000 feet, to avoid the worst anti-aircraft fire. B-26 Marauders and A-20 Havocs conducted dozens of strikes. The results were frustrating. Bomb damage assessments showed hundreds of bombs dropped, minimal bridge damage achieved. Captain James Connelly's squadron, the 495th Bombardment Squadron of the 344th Bomb Group, had flown 7 bridge bombing missions in the first 2 weeks of March 1945. They'd achieved 0 confirmed bridge destructions. Connelly, who'd been a high school mathematics teacher before the war, started analyzing the geometry problem during the long flights back to base in France. The mathematical reality was straightforward. A bridge presents 2 dimensions, length and width. Flying parallel to the length gave the bombardier more target dimension in one axis, but created a guidance problem in the perpendicular axis. Every foot of lateral drift multiplied the miss distance. Wind calculations had to be perfect. Airspeed had to be exact. Any turbulence during the bomb run meant a miss. But what if they approached perpendicular to the bridge? The target width increased from 20 feet to 300 feet. The margin for error expanded by a factor of 15. Yes, the length dimension shrank from 300 feet to 20 feet, but bombs fell in a predictable pattern based on release interval and ballistic trajectory. A bombardier could time a release sequence to ensure bombs landed in a tight string across that 20-foot dimension. Connelly proposed the idea to his bombardier, Lieutenant Chen, during a mission briefing on March 16th. Chen was skeptical. Training doctrine explicitly called for parallel approaches. Perpendicular bombing meant presenting the aircraft's side profile to anti-aircraft guns longer, increasing exposure time. It meant the navigator had to calculate an entirely different approach vector. It meant the bombardier had to retrain his muscle memory for target acquisition, but they'd failed 7 times using standard methods. Connelly argued they had nothing to lose by trying something different. The squadron commander gave reluctant approval for one experimental run. If it failed, they'd return to conventional tactics. If it worked well, no one really expected it to work. The March 17th mission targeting a railway bridge south of Remagen was Connelly's test case. After 3 failed conventional runs exhausted most of their bomb load, he made the decision to try the perpendicular approach. The execution was more difficult than planning suggested. Banking 90 degrees to the bridge's long axis meant the navigator had to completely recalculate wind drift. Chen had to acquire the target from an unfamiliar angle. The pilot had to hold the aircraft steady in what felt like an uncomfortable banking turn, even though they were wings level relative to their new approach vector. Chen released 12 bombs in rapid sequence, spacing them based on his calculations of how far each bomb would travel during the aircraft's crossing of the bridge's 20-foot width. The bombs fell in a nearly perfect line across the bridge's narrow dimension. One struck the critical support pier. Pure luck? Perhaps, but it was a hit using perpendicular geometry after 3 misses using parallel geometry. Word of Connelly's success spread through informal channels faster than official reports could climb the command structure. Bomber crews talked to each other at bases across France and England. Within days, other squadrons were attempting perpendicular approaches on bridge targets. The results were immediately, dramatically better. A documented mission from March 23, 1945, involved 12 B-26 seconds from the 391st Bomb Group attacking a bridge over the Moselle River. 6 aircraft used conventional parallel approaches. 6 used perpendicular approaches. The parallel approach aircraft dropped 72 bombs and achieved 0 hits. The perpendicular approach aircraft dropped 72 bombs and scored 5 direct hits, completely destroying the bridge. The difference wasn't skill or luck. It was geometry. Bombardiers quickly discovered that perpendicular bombing required different techniques. Instead of tracking the target for an extended time while the aircraft flew along its length, they had to acquire the target, calculate instantly, and release the entire bomb load in a compressed time window, often less than 3 seconds. This demanded intense concentration and split-second timing, but it eliminated the sustained tracking errors that plagued parallel approaches. The physics of bomb ballistics actually favored perpendicular approaches. Bombs didn't fall straight down. They followed parabolic trajectories influenced by the aircraft's forward velocity, altitude, wind, and air density. In a parallel approach, any error in calculating these factors pushed bombs off the narrow target laterally. In a perpendicular approach, those same errors pushed bombs forward or backward along the bridge's length, where there was 15 times more margin for error. Anti-aircraft gunners initially struggled to adjust to perpendicular bombing runs. German flak doctrine positioned guns to track aircraft flying predictable straight paths toward or along targets. Bombers approaching from unexpected angles created firing solution problems. Gunners had to recalculate lead times and deflection angles. By the time they adjusted, the bombing run was often complete and the aircraft turning away. This didn't mean perpendicular approaches were safe. Aircraft still flew through flak fields, crews still died, but the tactical advantage lay in unpredictability. German anti-aircraft commanders couldn't simultaneously defend against parallel and perpendicular approaches from every direction. American bomber groups began varying their approach angles, sometimes parallel, sometimes perpendicular, sometimes at oblique angles between the two. This forced German defenders to spread their fire, reducing effectiveness against any single approach vector. The 9th Air Force officially recognized perpendicular bombing tactics in late March 1945. A tactical bulletin distributed to bomb groups described the technique, provided mathematical tables for bombardiers calculating release points, and authorized commanders to employ perpendicular approaches when appropriate. This represented remarkably fast institutional adaptation from field innovation to official doctrine in less than 2 weeks. Not every bridge attack suited perpendicular bombing. Some targets had terrain features or flak concentrations that made perpendicular approaches suicidal. Some bridges spanned narrow gorges where maneuvering room didn't exist. Experienced squadron commanders learned to assess each target individually, choosing the approach geometry that balanced hit probability against crew survival. This tactical flexibility, the ability to choose the right technique for each specific situation, marked the maturation of American tactical bombing doctrine. German military engineers watched their transportation networks collapse under this new bombing approach with growing alarm. Railway bridges were critical infrastructure. Each destroyed bridge meant longer supply routes, delayed reinforcements, increased fuel consumption for detours. By April 1945, American and British bombers had destroyed or damaged over 200 German railway bridges, many through perpendicular bombing tactics. The Wehrmacht's ability to move forces to threatened sectors deteriorated rapidly. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German anti-aircraft doctrine attempted to adapt. Artillery commanders received instructions to position guns for all-around defense rather than concentrating on expected approach corridors. But Germany, in early 1945, lacked the resources for comprehensive flak coverage. Guns, ammunition, and trained crews were increasingly scarce. Every flak battery defending a bridge was a battery not defending a city or military installation. The targeting of bridges forced German commanders into impossible resource allocation decisions. Some German engineers attempted to make bridges more resilient to bombing. They reinforced support structures, added redundant spans, even constructed temporary bridges alongside damaged ones. But engineering couldn't overcome the mathematical reality that perpendicular bombing had changed. A tactic that tripled hit rates meant 3 times as many bridges destroyed for the same number of sorties. Germany's infrastructure simply couldn't be rebuilt or reinforced fast enough. The tactical innovation spread beyond bridge bombing. By April 1945, American bomber crews were applying perpendicular geometry to other narrow targets: viaducts, railway cuts, narrow factory buildings. Any target whose dimensions presented the traditional long and narrow problem became a candidate for perpendicular attack. Hit rates on these precision targets improved across the board. The refinement of perpendicular bombing tactics through spring 1945 revealed layers of complexity that the initial successes had obscured. What worked as desperate improvisation needed systematic development to become reliable doctrine. Bomber crews, bombardiers, and intelligence officers collaboratively evolved the technique into something far more sophisticated than simply flying sideways at bridges. Lieutenant Robert Chen, the bombardier who'd executed that first successful perpendicular run with Captain Connelly, became an informal instructor for the technique. Between missions, Chen worked with other bombardiers in the 344th Bomb Group, teaching the mental calculations required for perpendicular releases. The mathematics were deceptively simple but unforgiving under combat conditions. The critical variable was time compression. In a conventional parallel approach, a bombardier might track the target for 15 to 20 seconds before release, making continuous adjustments. In a perpendicular approach, the entire bombing solution had to be calculated and executed in 3 to 5 seconds, the time it took for an aircraft traveling 250 miles per hour to cross a bridge's 20-foot width. Chen developed a checklist approach. First, identify the bridge's orientation relative to the aircraft's heading. Second, calculate the perpendicular approach vector accounting for wind drift. Third, Estimate the altitude-velocity combination that would produce the correct bomb spacing. Fourth, mark the visual release point. Fifth, commit to the release sequence without hesitation. Any delay or second-guessing meant missing the compressed timing window entirely. The Bombardier's challenge was amplified by the Norden bombsight, the highly classified optical computing device that American bombers relied upon for precision bombing. The Norden was engineered for sustained tracking runs. Its gyroscopic stabilization and automatic release mechanisms worked beautifully when the Bombardier had time to fine-tune the solution. But perpendicular runs didn't provide that time. Experienced bombardiers learned to use the Norden for initial calculations, but rely on manual releases for the actual drop. They'd use the sight to determine the correct approach angle and estimate the release point, then physically toggle the bomb release switches by hand, spacing the releases based on practiced timing rather than the automatic sequencer. This hybrid technology for calculation, human judgment for execution, produced better results than either pure technology or pure instinct alone. Pilots faced their own adaptation requirements. Perpendicular approaches demanded precise airspeed control and absolutely level flight during the critical release window. Any banking, any acceleration or deceleration changed the bomb's trajectory and destroyed the spacing calculation. B-26 pilots practiced maintaining exact airspeed within 2 miles per hour while flying through turbulence and flak. It was exhausting, demanding work that required total concentration. The navigator's role became more complex as well. Conventional bombing runs followed predictable routes. The navigator plotted a course to the initial point, then a straight run to the target. Perpendicular approaches required calculating oblique approach vectors that often didn't align with cardinal directions. Wind drift calculations became more critical, because any lateral deviation during the short crossing time meant a complete miss. Navigator training at advanced bases in England and France began incorporating perpendicular approach problems. Navigators worked through dozens of scenarios, different bridge orientations, various wind conditions, multiple altitude airspeed combinations. The goal was building mental muscle memory so that calculating a perpendicular vector became automatic even under the stress of combat with flak bursting around the aircraft. The results of this systematic development were measurable. By mid-April 1945, 9th Air Force bomb groups using trained perpendicular tactics were achieving hit rates approaching 50% on bridge targets. This represented a revolution in precision bombing effectiveness. Pre-war bombing theorists had estimated that 10% accuracy was optimistic for targets the size of bridges. Combat was proving that proper technique could achieve 5 times that rate. German intelligence services recognized the tactical shift. Captured documents from April 1945 include Luftwaffe assessment reports describing American bombers approaching bridges from unorthodox angles and achieving unexpectedly high accuracy. The reports recommended dispersing anti-aircraft defenses around full 360-degree perimeters of critical bridges, rather than concentrating guns along expected approach corridors. But recommendations were easier than implementation. Germany, in the war's final weeks, lacked the resources for comprehensive bridge defense. Flak ammunition was rationed. Experienced gun crews had been depleted by years of attrition. Young replacement crews with minimal training couldn't adjust fire quickly enough to track aircraft approaching from unexpected vectors. The tactical advantage belonged entirely to the attackers. Some German commanders attempted deception tactics. They'd construct dummy bridges near real bridges, hoping to draw bombing attacks to false targets. These efforts occasionally worked against high-altitude heavy bomber formations, where target identification was difficult. But medium bomber crews flying B-26 seconds and A-20 seconds at 10 to 15,000 feet could distinguish real bridges from fabrications. The dummy bridges absorbed no attacks and diverted no resources from their intended targets. The perpendicular bombing technique proved particularly effective against stone arch bridges, a common design across Europe. These structures were incredibly durable against near misses. Bombs exploding in the water beside a stone bridge rarely caused significant damage. But a direct hit on a single arch could collapse the entire span through progressive structural failure. A documented attack on March 29, 1945, illustrated this perfectly. The target was a medieval stone bridge over the Lahn River that had stood for 600 years. Previous bombing attacks had cratered the approaches but left the bridge itself intact. 12 B-26 seconds from the 386th Bomb Group executed perpendicular runs from different angles, essentially attacking the bridge from multiple compass points in sequence. The first flight scored 2 hits on the northern arches. The structure held, though damaged. The second flight approached from 90 degrees different heading and hit the southern arches. The third flight attacked from yet another angle and struck the center span. The cumulative damage exceeded the structure's engineering tolerances. The entire bridge collapsed into the Lahn within an hour of the attack. German engineers estimated repair would take months. The war ended before reconstruction even began. This multi-angle perpendicular technique became standard for especially critical targets. Instead of repeated attacks, from the same direction, bomber groups would coordinate simultaneous or sequential attacks from different vectors. This overwhelmed German defences and ensured that even if some flights missed, others would likely hit from their different approach angles. The mathematics of probability worked in favour of the attackers. Fighter escort tactics had to adapt to perpendicular bombing runs as well. P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang fighters escorting bombers couldn't simply fly straight and level above the bomber formation as they did during conventional runs. Perpendicular approaches meant bombers were crossing targets quickly, often from unexpected directions. Fighter pilots had to maintain more dynamic positions, ready to cover bombers coming from various vectors rather than a single predictable approach corridor. This created coordination challenges, but also opportunities. Fighters could time their strafing runs on flak positions to coincide with bomber attacks from perpendicular angles. While German gunners tracked bombers crossing from one direction, fighters would hit them from another. This combined arms approach, bombers and fighters attacking from different vectors simultaneously, proved devastatingly effective in suppressing anti-aircraft fire. The crew coordination required for successful perpendicular bombing represented a maturation of American combat aviation. Pilot, bombardier, and navigator had to work as a seamless team with no margin for miscommunication. Radio discipline became critical. Crews developed shorthand communication methods, coded phrases that conveyed complex information in seconds. Perpendicular right meant approach from the right side of the bridge's orientation. Quick cross meant maximum speed during the release window. Offset north meant wind drift required adjusting the approach vector northward. These communication protocols weren't in any manual. They emerged from crews flying together, learning each other's thought processes, developing trust built through repeated missions. The best crews operated almost telepathically, the navigator calculating, the pilot adjusting, the bombardier releasing, all without extensive verbal coordination because each man knew what the others needed. The psychological dimension of perpendicular bombing differed from conventional runs. Traditional bombing attacks involved sustained exposure to danger. The aircraft flew straight and level through flak fields for 30 or more seconds during the bombing run. Perpendicular runs compressed that exposure time to 5 or 10 seconds. The intensity was higher, but the duration shorter. Some crews preferred this, a brief spike of maximum danger versus prolonged moderate danger. Others found the compression more stressful, precisely because it demanded flawless execution in a tiny time window. Medical officers at bomber bases noticed differences in combat stress symptoms between crews flying primarily perpendicular runs versus conventional runs. The compressed danger crews showed higher acute stress responses, elevated heart rates, adrenaline spikes, but seemed to recover faster between missions. The sustained danger crews showed lower acute responses, but accumulated fatigue over time. Neither approach was categorically better or worse for crew psychological health. Individual temperament determined which stress profile a crew member handled better. By late April 1945, perpendicular bombing tactics had become so widespread that German military communications sometimes referred to American bomber attacks simply as cross-bombing, rather than using traditional terminology. The technique had become definitional, the characteristic approach that distinguished American precision bombing in the war's final months. The tactical success created strategic effects beyond simply destroying bridges. German military logistics planning had to assume that any bridge was vulnerable and that backup routes were necessary. This assumption forced longer supply lines, consumed more fuel, and created delays that cascaded through the entire Wehrmacht operational system. A single destroyed bridge didn't just cut one route, it created ripple effects across entire sectors, as traffic rerouted through alternate crossings that became congested and themselves became priority bombing targets. American intelligence analysts tracking German military communications documented the effects. Intercepted messages from April 1945 showed German commanders requesting permission for troop movements that would normally take hours but now required days because of destroyed bridges. Panzer divisions ordered to reinforce threatened sectors arrived too late to affect battles because the most direct routes were impassable. Artillery units couldn't reach firing positions before enemy advances overran them. The cumulative effect of sustained bridge bombing, amplified by the tripled hit rates from perpendicular tactics, was operational paralysis. German forces in Western Germany during April 1945 retained combat capability. They had units, weapons, ammunition. What they couldn't do was move those resources to where they were needed. The transportation network's collapse transformed potentially effective defensive operations into isolated, disconnected actions that American and British forces could defeat piecemeal. Some military historians argue that perpendicular bridge bombing shortened the European war by several weeks. This is impossible to prove definitively, but the logic is compelling. Every destroyed bridge delayed German responses to Allied advances. Every delay created opportunities for exploitation. The faster collapse of German defensive coherence in April 1945 compared to the hard fighting in the Ardennes during December 1944, partly reflected the destruction of Germany's transportation infrastructure through the precision bombing that suddenly became far more precise. The technique's legacy extended well beyond World War II's conclusion. Post-war analysis of bombing effectiveness identified perpendicular bridge attacks as one of the most successful tactical innovations of the Strategic Air Campaign. The Army Air Forces Evaluation Board, assessing bombing accuracy across the entire European theatre, noted that bridge hit rates increased by over 200% in the final 3 months of the war compared to the previous 6 months. The primary variable explaining this improvement was adoption of perpendicular bombing geometry. The Korean War saw immediate application of these lessons. When American and United Nations forces needed to destroy bridges in North Korea to disrupt Chinese and North Korean supply lines, the doctrine developed over Europe in 1945 was applied directly. B-29 superfortresses, attacking the bridges over the Yalu River, used perpendicular approaches to maximize hit probability. Navy and Marine Corps attack aircraft flying from carriers employed similar tactics against bridge targets throughout the Korean peninsula. The mathematical principles underlying perpendicular bombing became standard instruction at Air Force bombardier training schools during the 1950s. Students learned both parallel and perpendicular approaches, with the choice depending on target characteristics, defensive concentrations, and approach geography. The tactical flexibility that evolved through combat experience became institutionalized doctrine. Modern precision-guided munitions have made the geometric considerations of perpendicular bombing largely obsolete. A laser-guided bomb or GPS-guided munition can strike a bridge from virtually any angle with comparable accuracy. But the underlying principle that target geometry should determine attack geometry rather than accepting standardized approaches regardless of target characteristics remains central to weapons employment training. The men who developed perpendicular bombing tactics received recognition primarily within the bomber community rather than public acknowledgement. Captain James Connelly completed his combat tour and returned to teaching mathematics in Ohio. He occasionally mentioned his wartime service, but never claimed credit for inventing sideways bombing. Lieutenant Robert Chen remained in the Air Force after the war, eventually retiring as a colonel. His personnel file includes commendations for innovative bombardier techniques, without specifying what those innovations were. The 344th Bomb Group, which flew some of the first operational perpendicular bombing missions, was credited with destroying 43 bridges during March and April 1945. Their unit history notes the adoption of alternative approach geometries as a key factor in their success. The clinical language obscures the reality desperate crews trying something that contradicted training because standard methods weren't working, discovering through trial and error that geometry mattered more than doctrine. Squadron after-action reports from spring 1945 contain dozens of first-person accounts describing perpendicular runs. Pilots describing the sensation of lining up crossways to a target, feeling exposed and vulnerable, trusting their bombardiers to execute flawlessly in compressed time. Bombardiers describing the intense focus required to calculate and release in seconds rather than the comfortable cushion of conventional runs. Navigators describing the mental gymnastics of plotting oblique approaches under combat pressure. These accounts reveal tactical innovation, as it actually occurs not through genius inspirations or engineering breakthroughs, but through incremental problem-solving by people facing lethal challenges with inadequate solutions. Someone tries something different. It works, or it doesn't. Success gets shared informally. Others try variations. Gradually, through collective iteration, a new technique emerges. Only later does institutional authority recognize and codify what combat crews have already proven through survival and success. The bridges of Germany in spring 1945 became laboratories for this kind of tactical evolution. Each destroyed span represented not just a target eliminated, but a data point proving that unconventional thinking could produce disproportionate results. The tripling of hit rates wasn't magic or luck. It was mathematics applied properly, understanding that target dimensions should dictate attack geometry, that sometimes sideways is the straightest path to success. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.